Dear church, let's continue our series on the Hall of Flaw by looking at Sarah. Hello, welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. We are still in the midst of transition, so therefore we are still doing the podcast out of my office. Very simple setup. I hope you'll bear with us as we continue to make this transition, but hopefully we'll be up and running like normal very soon. We've been involved in a series called The Hall of Flaw, where we're looking at Hebrews chapter 11 and some of those characters that are mentioned there and what we affectionately refer to as the Faith Hall of Fame. And what you notice about many of those people that are listed is that their faith is what is highlighted, but just about all of them had a major flaw or flaws in their lives. And I think it just goes to show us that failure doesn't have to be fatal, and it doesn't have to be final either. Houston, we have a problem. You might recognize those words from the Ron Howard film Apollo 13. That iconic line was spoken by astronaut Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks, as the crew realized that there was an issue with the oxygen tanks on the spacecraft. Now, in the days that followed, NASA and 3 astronauts on the Odyssey overcame numerous obstacles to arrive home safely. There was a detailed flight manual to go along with years of training. Onboard computers were supposed to provide guidance data, but disaster struck when the service module oxygen tanks exploded. The flight plan unraveled and was scrubbed. NASA and the flight crew found themselves in the unenviable position of trying to make Apollo 13 a successful failure. I've been there, haven't you? Not to outer space, but I've been in the unenviable position of trying to turn success into failure in this space. In fact, I feel like my entire existence up to this point has been trying to make life a successful failure. And maybe that's what life is all about. Perhaps it's about learning how to fail successfully, because you will fail. That's a guarantee. And you will fail more times than you could probably count. So the issue is not, what will I do if I ever experience failure? Now, the question is, when I do fail, how can I do it successfully? And that's what this series is all about. Like I said, as you scan through the list of names in the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, you notice something, that failure is associated with pretty much all of them. You know, it's interesting that some of these people will always be known by their failure, at least in our eyes. Like Rahab will forever be known as the prostitute. You know, we include that moniker with her name, Rahab the prostitute. That's how we separate her from all the other Rahabs we know, right? But this should speak volumes to us, and what it should say to us is there is no ditch that we can't climb out of. We don't have to dwell in the depths of despair. Who cares what everybody else thinks of you? Maybe your failure does define you in the eyes of everyone else, but God's definition of your life is all that really matters. Look with me at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. It says, "By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, even from one man, and one who was as good as dead at that, there were born descendants who were just as the stars of heaven in number, and as the innumerable grains of sand along the seashore." There's those words again, by faith. If you know Sarah's story, then you know that those 2 words, by faith, seem to be misapplied. Because when Sarah heard about the promise God made to Abraham, she didn't launch out in faith. She laughed. You see, God had made a promise to Abraham. Remember that promise, right? We talked about it last time. God tells Abraham that he will make a great nation out of him. That's the promise, a promise that is repeated 5 times, no less, from Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 21. But with the promise comes a problem. And what's the problem? Well, it's twofold. Number 1, Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren. She was unable to have children. And number 2, both Abraham and Sarah were old. Even if Sarah wasn't barren, she was 90. So how in the world was a 90-year-old woman going to have a child? Now, there was not a lot of faith on the part of Sarah in the beginning. She liked God's plan. To have a child would have been an amazing gift. But while she loved the plan, she didn't buy into the promise. Look with me at Genesis chapter 16 now. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him a child, but she had an Egyptian slave woman whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, 'See now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please have relations with my slave woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai, And so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Then he had relations with Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar became aware that she had conceived, her mistress was insignificant in her sight. So Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I put my slave woman into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was insignificant in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Look, your slave woman is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Here's the temptation that I'm sure all of us have faced, are facing, or will face in the future. It's the temptation to help God out. When you've been praying for and waiting on God to work and he doesn't act within your time frame, you kind of take matters into your own hands. That's what Sarah does. When there's a gap between the problem and the promise, we tend to retreat to the flesh. However, the way to bridge the gap between the problem and the promise is faith. The flesh is a human approach to fixing a problem that only God can handle. Sarah decides to take matters into her own hands. She lets the facts cancel out her faith. There's no way she can conceive at her age. God must be off his rocker. So she enlists the help of Hagar. But her plan creates an even bigger problem, which is usually what happens when we try to help God out. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, and Ishmael and Isaac have been fighting ever since. Sarah circumvented God, and it cost her. And not only did it cost her, but it caused collateral damage that became generational. You see, you and I were not born out of Hagar. We were born out of Sarah. And there's a huge difference between these two mothers. One represents the flesh, while the other represents the spirit. One represents the promise, while the other represents a circumventing of the promise. Look with me now at Genesis chapter 17. Beginning in verse 15, it reads like this. Then God said to Abram, "As for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her by the name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth to a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. So Abraham laughs at God's plan. You're telling me that a 100-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife are going to have a child? Come on, God. I mean, you can't be serious. But there is hope. Did you catch it? Although Sarah tried to circumvent God, God didn't dispose of the couple and look for someone else to fulfill his plan. No, he sticks with Abraham and Sarah. Even though they had little faith in God making a great nation out of them, God doesn't quit on them or his plan. He keeps the promise at the forefront. But notice what Abraham does. This has to be frustrating to God. Abraham says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." You're still going back to Ishmael? Look, forget Ishmael. Quit talking about Ishmael. Ishmael has nothing to do with the promise. Ishmael is your wife's failed attempt to bring about my promise. Quit going back to the flesh and trust me. The problem was bigger than Abraham and Sarah's faith at this point. So God's got to do some convincing. Look now at Genesis chapter 18, verses 9 and following. It says, "Then they said to him, 'Where is your wife Sarah?' And he said, 'There in the tent.' He said, 'I will certainly return to you at this time next year, and behold, your wife Sarah will have a son.' And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, 'After I become old, am I to have pleasure, my Lord being old also?' But the Lord said to Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I actually give birth to a child when I am so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son.' Sarah denied it, however, saying, 'I did not laugh,' for she was afraid. And he said, 'No, but you did laugh.'" Abraham wasn't the only one laughing. Sarah, too, laughs in the face of the promise. In her mind, the promise was too big, or the problem, I should say, was too big to overcome. The Bible makes the point to tell us over and over again that Sarah was old and how old she actually was. I think the Holy Spirit is wanting us to grasp how big the problem is so that we can further grasp just how big the promise is and how big our faith needs to be. So here we are. God gives the promise. Abraham and Sarah laugh in the face of the promise because they only see the enormity of the problem. But wait a minute. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11 states, by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. There's those words again. By faith, she considered him faithful who had promised. Now, we hadn't seen much faith up to this point. We've seen a whole lot of flesh, but not a lot of faith. We've seen both Sarah and her husband laughing in the face of the promise, but Hebrews 11 tells us that this laughing woman gets pregnant by faith. So this tells me that something happened between the laughing and Hagar and the birth of Isaac. What happened between chapters 16 through 18 to spark faith in the heart of Sarah? Well, I think, and this is my speculation, but I think the first thing that happened was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. God rained down his wrath upon these two cities, and Abraham and Sarah got to witness the power of the Almighty God. They saw the immeasurable power of God on full display. And I think the second thing that happened was that Abraham lied to the king Abimelech. Why is that important? Well, apparently Sarah was still a very attractive woman even at 90 years old. Abraham is so afraid of Abimelech that he lies and tells the king that Sarah is his sister. So Abimelech, thinking Sarah is single, takes her into his harem. While he's sleeping, the king has a dream. Verse 3, Genesis chapter 20 reads, but God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is married. And Abimelech pleads ignorance. We talked about this last week. I didn't know, he says. And God tells the king to return Sarah to Abraham immediately. Then notice verses 17 and 18. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his female slaves so that they gave birth to children. For the Lord had completely closed all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. It's interesting that God made sure that no one was getting pregnant in Abimelech's household until the king returned Sarah to her husband. Then that same God who closed the wombs of Abimelech's wives and concubines opened them. So if God can close and open the wombs of the household of Abimelech, and Abraham and Sarah notice this, then certainly he can make good on his promise to Abraham and Sarah. God is letting Sarah know that he controls who gets pregnant and who doesn't. If he wants her to have a baby, she's going to have a baby, period, exclamation point. So God displayed his power through the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and through the opening and closing of the wombs in Abimelech's household to increase the faith of Abraham and Sarah. But a promise is empty without any fulfillment. So look at chapter 21 of Genesis, verse 1. Then the Lord took note of Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham named his son, who was born to him, the son whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, and as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have given birth to a son in his old age. You know what the name Isaac means? It means he laughs. How appropriate, right? For some of you, life is pretty barren. Maybe life just isn't working out. Jesus promised abundant life, but you're not experiencing it. And so you question God. Why am I not married by now? Why can't I have children? Why isn't my career taking off? I should have a better life by now. For many folks, there is a gap between expectations and reality. And as a result, nothing is being birthed inside of you. Passion is gone. Hope seems dim. Life is barren. And your problems look bigger than the promise. It's a very simple rundown of what many people are going through. And the solution to the problem is just as simple. At least it sounds simple. The bridge between one's problems and the promise is faith. It's just that simple. But living in the barrenness is anything but easy. How do we survive until the promise comes to fruition? Well, we've got to fill the gap with something. And we all have a choice as to what that something is. God has made us a promise. And we know that whatever He promises, we can take to the bank. So in the meantime, let's not let the facts cancel out our faith. Let's not let our problems override the promise. Let's be firm, immovable, and excel in the work of the Lord, knowing that one day God will make good on His promise. Thank you for tuning in. If you have a question about today's episode or any episode, feel free to email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. I'm so thankful for you tuning in. We'll see you next time. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.